it is Jorge, and today we are learning Conquest and Consequence by Craig Bessink and the GMT Games. This game follows the beautiful game system that we first met in Triumph and Tragedy, and hopefully we are gonna see in future games as well. Now I will try to make this as much a standalone video as possible, but for your own sake I strongly recommend that you watch Triumph and Tragedy first. So I'll give you a few moments to do so. You will find the link somewhere, hopefully, I guess. And okay, if you are ready, or if you are brave enough to follow through, then let's go! In Conquest and Consequence, there are three players playing three factions. The factions are the Japanese, the militarists, the socialists, which is the Soviet faction or the communists, and the capitalists, which consists of the Americans and also possibly the British. So in this game, there is also the China Civil War ongoing. China consists of two factions. We've got the nationalists, which are aligned with USA, and the communists, which are aligned with the Soviet faction. So these two are called proxy powers, and each of those has got a foster factions. So the Soviet Union is the foster faction for the Reds or the communist China, and the USA is the foster faction for the nationalist China. There's also the British Empire, which will possibly join the war, but it starts as neutral in this game. Now, all factions start the game as a rival to each other. I mean, there are three great powers, the Soviet Union, the USA, and Japan, and they are all rivals, but not exactly enemies, until they declare war upon each other. So when we say rivals, we refer to factions that are not at war yet. They are at peace. And upon declaring war upon one another, they become enemies to each other. An exception is the two proxy powers, the two sides of the Chinese Civil War. They start the game as enemies to each other. So communists and nationalists are enemies from the get-go. And they are rival to the great powers until a great power declares kind of a war upon the proxy powers, in which case they become enemies. Now we've got our map. This is the map of the so-called Pacific Theater. It includes the Pacific Ocean itself, plus Indochina, which is this lower part of the map, as well as China and the part of the Soviet Union, namely the Siberian part, and of course Japan, and part of the USA, or in particular the West Coast. So there are land areas, these are land areas, and there are also sea areas, which is this one. This one, the darker blue ones, are oceans. And just like in Triumph and Tragedy, we've also got some straits, which is, for example, this one is a strait. But in this game, we've also got some other additional features, which is, for example, these islets and islet groups, and also some islet bases. Don't worry, we shall talk more about them in detail later on. But we've also got a lot of islands, which is an extra in this scenario. Now, on with the game sequence. The game starts in the year 1936, and it is conducted until possibly the end of 1945, so a maximum of 10 years. And each year consists of the following steps: the New Year phase, and then we've got the production of the factions. So each faction produces its military units and cards. And then we've got the government, which is actually the diplomacy and technology phase. And then we've got 3 seasons mainly: spring, summer, and fall. And after the fall, there's a special winter season. And then we go on with the next year, so on. At the start of the New Year phase, all players who have not yet engaged in a war with the other factions or have not attacked the neutral nations draw a peace dividend, a random one from a draw cup or bag or whatever. These peace dividend values range from 0 to 2, and they draw random ones, and this value will be worth some victory points, as we're gonna see later. We also shuffle possibly used cards into the two distinct decks. We've got two decks in this game. This is the investment deck, which includes technology cards, and this is the action deck, which includes diplomacy cards. We shuffle all used cards into the decks, and we also roll a die to determine the turn order. For example, if you look at these numbers, if we roll a 5, for example, the turn order would be the following. For a 5, the Soviets play first. We use this red track for the Soviets, and then it goes to this side, which means the Americans or the capitalists, and then turn moves to the Japanese, and so on. This applies to all subsequent phases of the year, so you roll for the turn order once and for all, every year. And after finishing with this New Year sequence, and of course I'm not going to go into many details about these particular events that follow some particular New Year phases. So after finishing with that, we move to the production phase. So on with the production phase. In this phase, following the turn order, each faction determines its production level. So let's use the Japanese for example. In order to determine your production, if you are at peace, you consult these two markers on your production track. This is the population value, and this is the industry value. The lower of these two is your production level. So for example, the Japanese have a population value of 10 and an industry value of 11. So their production level is 10 because of the population. But when a faction goes at war, you also count the resources. So for example, if the Japanese go to war, then this resource marker is flipped. And this indicates that you have also got to take the resources into account. So the lowest one will be the resources then, and the Japanese production level will drop to 5. So this has to be taken into account before going to war. Now, on the map, you can see some beautiful indicators of population and resources. For example, this triangular symbol of the resources you can also find on the map, which means these areas are worth resources. For example, the region of Peiping has a value of 2 resources. And you can also do the same for populations. For example, Tsingtao has got a population value of 1, or Mukden, which as we are later gonna see is a sub-capital, has got a population value of 2, which is all summarized in the map cheat sheet, which is right here. But don't worry about that, we shall cover this shortly. You will notice that there is also these red triangles, which is for resources, but this resource in particular, in Dutch East Indies, are worth double value for Japan. So for example, if the Japanese conquer this one, they have got 2 resource value for the petrols of Dutch East Indies, or if they conquer Sumatra, they've got a resource value of 4 for the Japanese. So as you understand, this is very important for the Japanese, as was historically. So let's talk about some details in particular. Every faction has got its main capitals and its sub-capitals. So for example, the Japanese main capital is the city of Tokyo. And as you can see in this chart again, the population value of the main capital is 3. So Tokyo is worth 3 population, plus 1 resource point, as you may see on the map. Also, the Japanese have got the subcapitals of Osaka and Mukden, which is the capital of this Manchuria region. Historically speaking, the Japanese had conquered the area of Manchuria, northern China, by 1936. So this starts under Japanese control. And as for the other factions, the Soviets have got only one subcapital, which is Novosibirsk in Siberia. And as for the other factions, the Americans have got their capital of Los Angeles, which again has got a population value of 3, plus also a resource value of 3. And they've also got their subcapital of New Delhi and their subcapital of Nanking, which belongs to the nationalist China, their proxy power. So the value of the subcapitals is 2 population plus whatever resources they got. And there are also the capital cities or just cities, like Suzhou, for example. When you see this symbol, it has got a population value of 1, and these are towns which are smaller and have got no population value. They've got a master value, but we're gonna talk about that later on. So back to the production procedure. After determining the production level by consulting the resources, population, and industry, depending again on whether you are at war or not, then we use our production. What can we do with our production? Actually, 3 things mainly. We can build units on the map, we can build our armies, or we can draw cards from the 2 respective decks, which again can be diplomacy cards or action cards or investment cards, which mainly is technology and industry cards. So each production value gets you 1 card or 1 unit build. So for example, you can spend 2 production on 2 diplomacy cards and 2 production on 2 technology cards, and then you can spend the rest of your production for building units. So this is the time to talk a bit more in detail about our units in this game. So let us talk about building our units. When I say building, I mean either building new units on the map or upgrading already existing units. Our units are these blocks, and they've got their combat value, or strength if you want to call it so. This is a unit of 1 combat value, if you look at it this way, because it's got 1 dot here, or 1 pip. And then if you upgrade it, it will go this way, which means 2 combat value or 3 combat value. So in your production phase, you can either build new units, which would be cadres, like this one, which got a 1 combat value. We call this a cadre because it has just been produced or built. Or you can build up your already existing units by upgrading them and giving them 1 more combat value. So you can't build the same unit twice. You can't build a cadre and then promote it in the same production phase. And of course, you can't upgrade the unit twice either. You choose and do 1 of the 2. Now, where can you build your units? You can only build the cadres in your home territories. So let's have a look at the map again. The home territory for the Japanese is these home islands, of course. And for the Soviets, their home territory is this red territory. So this is where new units can be built during the production phase. And for the Americans, these dark green land areas is their home territory. And we have also got the British home territory, which is this dark blue color. And of course, we've also got to talk about the proxy powers in this game. This is nationalist China's home territory, and this region of Xi'an is the communists' home territory. So all the rest in lighter shades of the respective nation is the colonies. So for example, India is a colony for the British Empire, and these are colonies for the Americans, the light green, for example, and this, the light yellow, is colony for the Japanese, and the Soviets have got no colonies. Sorry. You can find an exhaustive list of the colonies in the game's rulebook, but we're gonna cover the most important of them. So once more, you can build new cadres in home territory only. So, for example, the British cannot build their units in India. I mean, they cannot build the cadres, but of course, they can upgrade already existing units. So, for example, if a British infantry unit is here in Dhaka, then you can build it up by add one combat value and making it from a 1 combat value infantry unit to a 2 combat value 1. An exception to that is the forts. This unit is a fort, so you can build a new one even in territories that you control but are not home territory. So if you, for example, control Guam as the Japanese, you can build a fort there. So you can build a fort anywhere in spaces you control, and you can only build one fort per space. There's no second fort in the same space because these are defensive fortifications, and of course they can't move. You build them to fortify the area, to defend it, and then you don't move it. Only one fort per area. And also, in this scenario, in Conquest and the Consequence, we've also got some special forces, which are the SNLFs for the Japanese and the Marines for the Americans. These are special units. So the Japanese can also build the SNLF Marines or Special Naval Landing Forces in islands and straits. So if they control an island or a strait, they can build their SNLFs there, even if it is not their home territory. This does not apply to the US Marines, however. This is only a Japanese privilege. So it is time to talk a bit more in detail about these features. These are islands. You can see these weird shapes. These are islands. These ones, the square ones, are islets. And these, the bigger ones, are islet groups because they consist of multiple islets. And we've also got the islet bases, which is this hexagonal shape. So, what's so special about them? First of all, the Japanese SNLFs can be built as forts in every kind of island. It does not have to be your home territory. You can build them. These islets and islet groups and islet bases are also considered as islands. So you can build SNLFs in them. But in these ones, you can't build any units but SNLFs and forts. So if you've got a tank here, for example, which is a tank in case you hadn't noticed, you can't build it further here in Wake because this is an islet and you can only build the forts and the SNLFs here. The same applies to the islet groups, but in the single islets, there is an extra restriction that at the end of its phase, you can only have one unit here. There's no room for a second unit, so any excess one will be eliminated. And these are islet bases. So these are considered the bigger islands in sites with bigger installations, let's say. So for example, you can build up your units here. If you've got a tank here, you can build it further in islet bases. Okay, the production follows the proxy production phase. So first of all, the proxy power does its own production, and then its foster faction does its own production after that. For example, it's the turn of the Americans or the capitalists to do their production phase. You will start with the production of your proxy power, which is the nationalist China, and then you will follow it up by the US production. So let's talk a bit more about the proxy production. we've got the nationalist China, which determines its production level based on these markers. This is a marker to indicate that the nationalists are controlling 4 cities in China. And you can also see this value on the map. For example, they control the city of Nanking, which is the sub-capital and is worth 2 population. And also Suzhou and Wuhan. So it's a total of 4 population value. That's why their cities marker is at 4. But they also have got to consult their KMT or Kuomintang marker, which starts at 1. This indicates the level of loyalty of the people to the regime. So because KMT is at 1, they have only got a production level of 1 at the year of 1936. So how do they spend their production? They build units. They build 1 unit because it is a level of 1 in one of their home regions, which of course can be a cadre, or they can build it up, an already existing unit. And then the Americans do their own production. It's similar with the Soviet faction and the communists, although in the communist Chinese case, we've got to consult these 2 markers. This is the master value, which means how much population they control in China. It starts at 2 because they control the city of Xi'an, which again, as you can see, has got a master value of 2. I know we haven't not talked about the master value yet, but just consult this chart for now. They control the city of Xi'an, which has got a master value of 2, and their loyalty level is at 3. So the lower of the 2 is the master value, and we consult this one. So in the Communist China case, they draw cards equal to their production level. So they will draw 2 action cards from this deck. So depending on the Communist China's production level, they draw a number of action cards. So in 1936, they will be drawing 2 action cards. This is their proxy production. And then the Soviets, which is their foster faction, will follow up with their own production as normal. And again, when talking about the nationalist China, as we have mentioned, you can build 1 unit of nationalist China, but you cannot build it further. So if, for example, you build 1 unit during your proxy production, you cannot build it up further during the foster faction's normal production phase. You can only do it once per unit. Now, some restrictions. You cannot build up your units or build new units at sea, of course. So if you've got a ship at sea, you cannot build it. And you cannot build it if it is engaged in a battle. So, for example, if the Japanese are fighting in this area, you cannot build up your units or build new units in this area. And the last restriction is that you cannot build it if it is unsupplied. More on that later when we talk about the supply section of the game. So after having concluded our production phase and possibly having drawn our diplomacy cards or technology cards, each player, in turn order, decides to play a card if they want. So the cards of the action deck are like this. They've got 2 sides, each one of them showing a land area or nation on the map. So there are many nations that start the game not as home territory and not as colonies, but as neutrals. So, for example, Changsha starts the game as a neutral nation. These nations you can take control of either diplomatically during this phase or militarily during the subsequent phases. So during government, a player places influence in a neutral nation. Of course, you can't place influence in the colonies or home territory of your opponent, but you can try to diplomatically conquer the neutral nations. So in this case, we've got the choice to either play this card for Inner Mongolia, which is here, or for Vietnam, so we orientate it this way. And Vietnam is here. It consists of these 2 areas, northern and southern Vietnam. So each player in a row plays a card, and each card will give you one influence value. For example, if the Soviet player plays this card for Vietnam, then at the end of the government phase, they will place one influence in the capital of Vietnam, which is Saigon, and it also includes the whole nation, of course. This is not applied during the government phase, but only at the end of government phase, which is the diplomacy resolution. And the other players, in their turn, may also play a card for the same nation. So if another player plays Vietnam as well, so both cards are discarded. One cancels the other out. Players may pass, of course, but if they have passed, and if not all players pass in succession, then the players can play more cards during their phase. So you can pass in one turn and then play a card in the following turn. The government phase ends when all players pass in succession. So one thing you can do is play a card to possibly place influence at the end of the government phase. Another thing you can do is play some technology cards, and in order to play a technology card, you can play it in two ways. Either you play a duplicate of your technology, so two copies of the same card, like in this case Atomic Research 1. You can play two cards of the same type, and you acquire this technology. You keep only one card in front of you in your so-called secret vault on your side of the board, and the other one you discard to later be reshuffled into the deck at the start of the new year. But you can also play the technology in secret. So you keep both copies of the same card and you place it in your secret vault. So at the subsequent phase or point of the game, you will reveal it with immediate effects at any time you want. So I have to also mention that there is a hand limit for each player during the government phase, which varies depending on the faction. The Americans have got a hand limit of 8, which is checked at the end of government phase. So after this phase ends, you have got to discard the excess cards from your hand. The Japanese have got a hand limit of 7, and the Soviets have got a hand limit of 6. Now the reason I mention it right now is that these cards in your secret vault, it's hidden technology that you have, reduces your hand limit by 1. So you have to also take that into account before concluding your government phase. And of course you can reveal your technology if you want and discard the duplicate, so that your hand limit is again increased back to normal. The technologies may give you various benefits, but for now let's just say that there is these special blue cards which you can play not to acquire a technological advantage, but for some immediate effects, like this spy ring card allows you to blindly take one card from a rival's hand, which will hurt their hand, of course. And there's also some wild cards. So what does this one state? For example, this is valid from year 1940 onwards, and you can use it to duplicate one of the technologies listed on these cards. So you can either play it in conjunction with air defense radar or autocannons, for example, or one of the other technologies listed. And you can immediately acquire this technology if you play it revealed, or you can play it hidden as well and reveal this technology at a later point. Another thing you can do during the government phase is, of course, increase your industry production level. In this case, we consult these numbers, the factory value of each card. The cards have got various values from 1 to 4. So, in your turn, you can spend factory values equal to a number which depends on each nation. So, for example, the US player needs to spend a factory value of 7 in order to raise their industry by 1 level. So, if the Americans drop 2 cards of factory values of 4 and 3, for example, they increase their industry level by 1, which means in the next year their production level will be increased by 1. For the Japanese, the factory value needed to be discarded is 6, and for the Soviets it is 8. So it is significantly harder for the Soviets, but these numbers on the right indicate that if an enemy faction declares war upon you, your nation switches to a wartime economy mode, so the industry cost is reduced, and you can increase your industry level by spending 6 factory value or 4 factory value after the second declaration of war upon you. But at the start of the game, it's 8 for the Soviets, for example. And you can only do this thing a maximum of twice per year. Also, some cards indicate this red technology. This is a Soviet only technology, but we are going to talk about this later on when talking about the Soviet faction in particular. Now, let's talk about the impact of diplomacy on a nation. So, after finishing the diplomacy phase or the government phase, we determine which nations we add influence upon. So, for example, the Soviet player has played one card for Vietnam, so he's placing one influence, and we indicate that by placing this influence marker. There are 3 levels of alignment for its neutral nation. So each neutral nation starts the game as unaligned or completely neutral. They're indifferent about the war in general. But when a faction places one influence upon a neutral nation, then they become an associate to that faction, which means they have not joined the war yet, but they provide the population and the resources to them. So the Soviets now get 1 resource for Hanoi and 1 population value for the value of Saigon. And if you can place 3 influence markers, then at the end of the government phase, this nation becomes a satellite or an ally. In this case, this nation not only provides you the resources and the population, but also their army is yours. So they immediately deploy units, and now we consult this chart. This is the master value of its nation and its space. So, for example, we see that a town has got a master value of 1, and the city has got a master value of 2. So in this case, Vietnam will provide the Soviets with 1 combat value unit for Hanoi, which could be, for example, this one, which is an infantry unit of 1 combat value, and also a 2 combat value infantry for Saigon, for example. These units are immediately deployed upon making the neutral nation a satellite of yours, so at the end of the government phase. I should also mention that there are some cards that add influence immediately, and they are wild, so you have got a lot of choices in how to spend them. So for example, let's have a look at this one, Birds of a Feather. The USA may place 1 influence in British Empire or Chongqing or Dutch East Indies or Gansu. If you are a Japanese player, this is different. You will place 1 influence in Shanxi or Inner Mongolia or Qingdao. And if you are a Soviet, your choices are Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Changsha, one of the 3. There is also a note that the US player shall place a 2 influence in China. So if you choose Chongqing or Gansu, which is in China, you will place 2 influence. But this ability of the US, which is called Chiang Kai-shek, is only valid if the Japanese have violated a neutral nation in China or a proxy power in China. So before the Japanese attack either the nationalists or the communists or a neutral nation in China, this is not applied. This only applies after that. So let's again divide the map. This is the region of China, which means if you see this line, this divides China from the rest of the map. So these spaces are all China. These ones are Indochina. You can always consult this line to determine where Indochina starts and where China starts. Of course, it finishes somewhere like here. And beyond that, this is Mongolia, and this is the Soviet Union. And this region, the yellow one, is Manchuria. It belongs in China, technically, but it starts under Japanese control as a colony of China, and its capital is Mukden. So, one influence marker makes this nation an associate of yours. 3 influence is turned into this side, which means satellite of yours. And if you only got 2 influence markers, this nation is a protectorate, which means it again has not joined the war actively. It is an associate of yours. It gives you its population and the resources, but it is also a protectorate of yours, which means again you cannot enter this nation or your alliance breaks and you lose everything. But if another nation violates this nation's neutrality, so if the Japanese or the Americans attack this one, then it is immediately turned into a satellite. This is the only difference from an associate. So if it is an associate, it provides you the resources and population, but if another faction violates this, it is just gone, and this nation fights on its own against the invader. But if it is a protectorate, then the moment another faction attacks, this becomes a satellite of yours, and it immediately deploys its units, as we have mentioned previously. These units can be of any type, depending on what the Soviet faction chooses in this case. So it could be an infantry, or it could be some fleets, for example, or air forces. Now, depending on whether it is Indochina or another neutral nation, there is a different unit nationality. Let's talk about this more in detail. You will notice that the Americans and the Soviets have got some special kind of flags or markers used for this purpose. So, if diplomatically the Americans lay influence in China, we don't use this marker, the American one, but we rather use this one. So, this is the influence marker of the Americans in China. So, practically, it's not the Americans gaining influence here, it is the nationalist China gaining influence in Canton, for example. So, if the Americans place one influence here, this means that this is an associate of the USA, and it provides one population and one resource. And if this turns into a control marker, which means Canton is a satellite of the US or the nationalist China, then first of all, you also add the cities count. So upon controlling Canton, the city's control level increases by 1. You only increase this one after the nationalist China or communist China controls another city. And upon doing so, the units deployed are of Chinese nationality, which means you can only deploy Chinese units, not American ones here, by making this nation a satellite of yours. And it's practically the same for Indochina. For example, if the Americans gain influence here, it is actually an influence of the British Empire, and when this turns into control, the units deployed here are of British nationality. So it's not the Americans conquering this one, it's the British Empire adding to its territories. Same for the communists in China. So as Soviet, you will place this marker when gaining control over Chinese territory. And if this turns into control, the units deployed, which in this case will be of 1 master value, thanks to Shanxi, it will not be a Soviet unit, but it will rather be a Red China unit. So these special cards are intimidation. You can use this to place one influence instantly in any neutral adjacent to friendly territory. And in this case, you consult the map and the borders. If you see any kind of borders, you can place influence in this nation which is adjacent to your control. For example, The only exception is these impassable terrain features. These are entirely out of the game. So for example, you can't bypass this one and placing influence here by considering this adjacent. Okay, and there are some particular cards that remove influence markers. In this case, if for example the Soviets have played this card for Vietnam, the influence marker is not placed yet, so you can't remove it. But if they have played the card that allows them to place one influence, this is placed instantly by these yellow cards. So later on, this can be removed. And at the end of the government phase, if you place influence in a nation that has an enemies or rivals influence marker, then each 1 point of yours removes one influence of them. And now it's time to talk about the special case of the British Empire and influence over the British Empire. British Empire starts the game as neutral with its home territory and its colonies, but the US may place influence and turn it into a satellite of them. So, for example, one influence in the capital of British Empire in New Delhi makes British Empire a US associate. 2 influence will make it a protectorate, and 3 influence will turn it into a US satellite. Now, the British Empire starts with some units already deployed in certain spaces from the setup, but these units can only be moved inside the British Empire and in open seas, which mean seas not controlled by your opponent. So, if for example the Americans have made Dutch East Indies a US satellite, this also belongs to the British Empire and you can move your units here. But you cannot move your units anywhere else. You cannot enter US territory. And the US cannot enter British territory either. After the British Empire joins the war, so if you have made them a satellite of yours, then this restriction is lifted. British units may enter US territory or other territories and fight enemies, and also the US units can enter the British Empire territory. The other factions, Japanese and Soviets, can place influence in the British Empire, but they will never gain control over the British resources or make the British an ally of theirs. This only delays the American influence. And you will also notice in this year track that in 1939, 1940 and 1941, the US gains one influence over the British Empire, which may turn them into satellites. After British Empire turns into a US satellite, no additional units are deployed as per the master values. There is also one special rule that if the Japanese invade Vietnam or the Dutch East Indies, there is one US influence automatically added into British Empire, the so-called Clouds of War rule. And if another faction attacks the British Empire, so if the Soviets or the Japanese attack the British Empire by entering their territory, for example, with their units, then the British instantly join the war as US satellites.